All right, kittens, let's jump right in with our very first topic, which is going to be composition. Composition is a term that gets used in the art world all the time. People who are artists seem to understand it intrinsically, but very few can describe it or define it for you if you ask them. So let's talk about what composition actually is. Composition is simple. It's deciding what you want to exclude or include in your frame. So for example, right now I'm currently in a frame. This is the frame that's around me, right? You can't see all of my body, you can't see everything. You don't even know if I'm wearing pants. Why? Because I have chosen not to include the lower half of my body in this composition. So let's talk about why we make the decisions we make when we think about composition, and why it matters just as much what we don't include in the frame as what we do include in the frame. So what makes a good photo and what makes an okay photo is going to be what you choose to do as a photographer. And the first thing that you're going to decide is your composition, is what you're going to include in your photographic frame. So let's talk about how photographers do this and why there are some things photographically and compositionally we find attractive and some things that kind of are off-putting for us. It all comes down to math. I know that's not what you wanted to hear. Nobody ever wants to hear that it all comes down to math, but it does. It comes down to a mathematic principle called the golden ratio. The golden ratio is often used in arts, in music, in science, in architecture, and it's a mathematical equation for what we find aesthetically pleasing. So when I talk about aesthetics, I'm talking about how we see and why we are attracted to what we see. Now, in photography, what does this mean for us? Well, there's all sorts of ways that we can try to replicate the golden ratio using different tools and tricks as photographers. The first one that I want to point out, which is going to be important whether you're making photographs, paintings, illustrations, or you're going to be shooting video, and it's called the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is about breaking down our view into a grid, like we're going to play tic-tac-toe, right? So if we were going to play tic-tac-toe and I was in the center of this grid, we'd draw a line, boop, 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 and then another one here, do-do-do-do-do, then one here, and then one here, right? So we've split the screen into 3 vertical columns and 3 horizontal rows, right? This is the rule of thirds, and it gets used all the time in photography. It's a rule of thumb that is a guideline that allows you to move your subject around the frame to come up with hopefully a more exciting or more interesting composition. So understanding where to put things in the rule of thirds takes practice, but it helps, and it helps to give your eyes freedom to move around the images. Most cameras nowadays, including your cell phone, have an option for you to put a grid on your screen. The grid is to help you with the rule of thirds. So when we break down the rule of thirds, we've got our lines, right? And you'll notice that there's points where the lines intersect that create these squares. Those points of intersection are called power points. Now, usually when you're making a composition and you're not sure where to put something, if you want us to stay engaged in an image, you want us to stay really excited about an image, you want to put the most important thing on those power points, right? So right now, my eyeball is on a PowerPoint, and I bet you're looking at that zit right underneath my eye because it's lit beautifully and it's right on a PowerPoint. And that's because I want you to see this giant pimple that I have right here. Look at that, drink that in. Here's a really, really nice photograph of a boat. And this particular boat has the grid already placed on it. And so if we look at this boat, we can see that the artist made some decisions about what to include and what to exclude from the frame. Now, the boat is not dead center of the image. The boat is kind of meandering through a couple of PowerPoints. And if we look at this, we can see that our eye kind of enters the frame over here by the back of the boat. It flows down the front of the boat, and because the boat's mast or bow or whatever that shit is in the front goes up through these other PowerPoints, it moves our eye back up into the frame, and then we're up in this blue sky. And then over here we have this island in the background, this dark piece here. Now that's adding some visual weight on another PowerPoint, and what that does is it creates a circular motion. If our eyes stay trapped in the image, chances are we're going to look at the image for longer. We're going to really ponder that image. We're going to spend more time with it. This is a photographic trick and technique that many artists use. They use this technique of moving your eye around the frame to keep you engaged, so you notice all the little things about the image. Now, here's another image of a boat. This one is obviously formatted very differently. So when we look at this photograph, you're probably thinking, well, that's a terrible photograph of a boat, right? You can't even see the boat. But I don't know that this is actually a photograph of the boat, right? This is actually a photograph of the reflection of the boat. And we know that because we can see that the mast of the boat, the bow here, and the lines are all kind of moving through these PowerPoints so that we stay engaged and we're focused on the water. Now we have a little bit of the boat at the top, but we're really focused on the boat's reflection. This is a photograph of the reflection of the boat, whereas this is a photograph of a boat. You see the difference? They both include a boat, but one is about the boat, the other is about the reflection of the boat. And we know that because the photographer has chosen to arrange everything in a certain composition using the rule of thirds. So the next compositional rule that we're going to talk about is leading lines. This is not like leading somebody on, like, hey, you know, I think you're kind of hot and like, call me. That's not a leading line. So for example, if we take a look at this beautiful photograph of a fence, we can see the city is kind of blurry in the background, but the lines are moving diagonally across this image. It's leading our eye throughout the frame. Here's a beautiful photograph of train tracks. These lines are moving us down in depth. We're kind of thinking about where the train is going or when it might be coming this way. There's also lines moving horizontally across the image, the lines of the tracks themselves running across, and we can see that they kind of recede into the distance. And this is a really interesting photograph. It is of a wedding couple, right? But what makes this image so interesting is all the lines that kind of spiral out from the center. Now you might be looking at this image going, hey, wait a minute, Izzy, this breaks the first rule of thirds because the subject is dead center. And you said that we should put something on the PowerPoint and not have our subject dead center. But my challenge to you is this photo really about these two people dancing in the center? Or is it about the beautiful lines that are kind of spiraling towards them? But what makes it interesting and why it's okay to break the rule of thirds is because these other lines are coming in to focus on these two people dancing, right? That's kind of awesome. And when we talk about leading lines, they don't always have to be physical, actual lines. Like, for example, this comes up in film all of the time. So leading lines can also be the movement of things, right? So if I'm, moving my hair, right? There's a movement here that creates line, that leads back to my face, that leads back to the subject of my image. Another application for breaking up your photographic frame, if the rule of thirds is maybe not working for you or it seems too mundane or pedestrian, you can always try using the golden triangle. This is another strategy for dividing the frame. Especially if you're attracted to diagonals, sometimes this is an easier one for people to work with. It feels less structured than the rule of thirds grid. So one thing to remember if you decide you want to go with the golden triangle rather than going with the just basic rule of thirds grid is that where those two lines on your triangle intersect, you're always going to be at a PowerPoint. So when we're talking about the bisection of our frame, you're always going to be at a PowerPoint if you're using the golden triangle. So when you're bisecting these images using these different techniques, one of the other terms that I want you to be aware of is if you're using the golden triangle, the point where those two lines intersect is often referred to as the cradle. This is often seen as a good place in the frame to position the elements of your picture. So if you go back to the image that you're looking at and you say, okay, what is it I really want my audience to focus on? What is it the first thing that I want them to see? Then you can try to go ahead and put that on that PowerPoint, or if you're using the golden triangle, on that cradle. Again, this is like 9 ways to skin a cat. You can choose the best method that works for you. Ultimately, these are just different strategies and techniques to help you start to see your images more critically and make more informed decisions about the kinds of images that you author. So let's talk about another one that's one of my personal favorites as a fan of sacred geometry. The final compositional tool that we're going to talk about is based on the golden ratio, and it's often referred to as the golden spiral or Fibonacci spiral. This is probably the most pleasing of all of these tricks, and if you can pull it off, your photo is probably going to be a pretty nice one. If it's used correctly, this one is going to be extremely aesthetically pleasing. I would venture a guess that if you go back to images that you just can't stop staring at, something about them just has totally got you wound up, and then you take this diagram and you place it over the image, chances are it might line up, because there's something about the Fibonacci spiral that we as humans are intrinsically attracted to. So interestingly enough, this mathematical principle has been seen in artwork as early as 400 BC. And today we refer to the lines by several names: the golden ratio, the golden mean, the divine proportion, Fibonacci spiral, whatever you want to call it. You should notice that it almost but not quite lines up with the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is just there to help you see what the golden mean or the golden ratio is, and sometimes it's easier for people to break down visually, whether they have a grid or not. But if you want it to be perfect, you're really looking at the Fibonacci spiral. So my challenge to you is to take this grid of the Fibonacci spiral and then go find some of your favorite images and see if they line up. And you'll probably notice that they're pretty damn close, especially the ones that you just can't seem to get out of your head. So now it's time to talk about the next step in making our photos stronger, and that's going to be thinking about framing and cropping. The single common biggest mistake that novice photographers make is they don't fill the frame with their subject. Instead, they use the little viewfinder and they put their subject in this tiny little space of the viewfinder, and what ends up happening is you have a picture of something like tiny blob shaped and then all this other shit around that you don't care about. That's not a good photograph. So let's try to break that habit. The viewfinder is there just like a tool for the rule of thirds or a grid or anything else. It's there to help you. So when you go to line up your photograph and you're looking through your viewfinder, don't only look at the little rectangle as center. Look at the edges. Look at the frame. What is included in the frame? What happens if you move your camera up a little bit or you move it down a little bit? Now, the thing that I want you guys to remember when you're thinking about making your photographs is that a photograph is a two-dimensional representation of a three-dimensional space, right? We live in a 3D world, but cameras can't see in 3D. What they do is they produce a flattened image that is a two-dimensional representation. So for example, right now, I'm in the foreground, my cat just walked out of the background, the room is behind me. If I move my hands into the front of the frame here, right, so now we have my hands here, my hands are in the foreground, I'm now in the middle ground, and the room is in the background. If we understand where things are photographically, then we can make better and more informed decisions about what we want to include in the frame. So for example, if you're going to snap an image and there is like a curtain behind somebody, it can look like the curtain is growing out of their head. Like right now, the curtain might look like it's growing out of my head, or a tree might look like it's growing out of my head, because the camera is going to flatten everything. So if you know that, you can make more informed decisions about where you want your subjects to stand, or if you want to move around so that you get a better image. Just some things to consider. Conversely, I want to talk a little bit about focus. So what you wanted to start to decide as you've kind of worked through some of the practice runs with your composition is focus. Focus, literal focus, is it blurry or is it not blurry, is also a great way to tell us what is important and what isn't important about your image. So for example, here's a photograph of a little girl coloring, right? And then here's the same image, but now this photograph is no longer of a little girl coloring. Now this photograph is of crayons, because we've changed the focus. In image number 1, the focus is the little girl in the coloring book, and the foreground is blurry. In image number 2, the focus in the foreground is on the crayons, and the little girl in the background is blurry. So it changes the context of the image, even though the subject is identical in both photographs. So thinking about focus is another way that you can start to make some informed decisions about what you want us to see and what you want us to focus on in your images. So the very last thing that we're going to talk about is viewpoint. Viewpoint is literally where the angle is that you are snapping your picture from, right? So selecting the position from which you are going to photograph the subject is just as important as the composition. I can't stress that enough. It takes practice, and you would be shocked at how many people pick up a camera and hold it directly in front of their face and only fire off images from this perspective. How boring can that be? So what I want you to think about is what happens when you change your viewpoint. How does that inform how we see the subject? If you're photographing a subject that cannot easily be moved, then the only way to change what is in the background is to choose a different viewpoint, right? So if you're at the zoo photographing animals, if you're photographing nature, you can't say, hey mountain, could you like take 2 steps to the left? Like, that's not gonna work. You're gonna have to actually physically move. You're gonna have to be responsible for changing your viewpoint. The subject itself can look quite different when viewed from different angles. So photos can be made to take on a whole new dynamic by selecting an extreme angle of view. So for example, if you're taking a sports shot and you want the person to look powerful and, domineering, take the photo from a lower angle, because what happens is it makes the person seem even bigger and more imposing. They're looking down at the camera. Now, if you're interested in the psychology of images, specifically in like model photography or portrait photography, take a look at Killing Us Softly, which is a documentary that discusses how advertising teaches us to see, and specifically how it teaches us to see women. What you'll notice is that many women, especially women who are taking self-portraits, often like to photograph from above. The camera is above them looking down at them. This makes them look younger. It also makes them look slimmer. It makes them look less physically imposing, and ultimately it makes them look more submissive. This might all be happening subconsciously. People don't always intend for this to be the meaning, but there is always an innate meaning when we think about our viewpoint. So just something to consider. We can get more into the psychology of photos and psychology of images in another video. We've talked about composition extensively, and now is an opportunity for you to take those same tips, tricks, and strategies and apply them to your own photographic work. So here's the deal. We live in a day and age where cameras are becoming increasingly more advanced, and there's little that stands between the professionals and the amateurs in the way of equipment and approach, right? We all have access to the same stuff. So what really helps a photo get to the next level is how well it's composed. So for this first assignment, what I want you to do is I want you to go out and I want you to take those rules and those principles of composition and explore them. Using the class lecture, I want you to go and find a subject, an object, or a landscape, and I want you to take at least 5 different photographs of it, making sure that you're varying your composition so that not all the images are alike. I want you to really push yourself to explore the various compositional rules that we talked about while still taking interesting and exciting photos. My advice to you is to shoot way more than 5 photos. That's the cool thing about digital photography. You can take a lot of different images and explore what works and what doesn't. So if you need to have 5 finished images of the same subject that are from different compositional angles, my advice would be to shoot closer to 20 to 40. If you're really excited about what you've shot and you want to share that with me, I'm going to have a link down below where you can upload your images, and if you'd like me to give you critique and feedback, I'd be happy to do so. Of course, if you have any questions between now and when you shoot your images and you want some feedback, you want some help, some direction, question, comments, queries, or you just want to tell me how pretty my makeup looks today, you can do all of that and more down below in the comments. I'm totally open to helping in any way that I can, so please don't hesitate to reach out and ask should you have any questions. And because I think that you're going to enjoy all of the great content coming your way soon, I really would encourage you to click subscribe and click like, and feel free to share this video with your friends. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Mama Cat out. Bye, kittens.